The door of the Croft homestead closed behind me with a sound as final as a spadeful of earth on a coffin. It was a sound that sealed one life and began another, though what kind of life, I could not imagine. My father-in-law, a man whose heart had hardened into a stone long before my Daniels was stopped, had stood on the porch, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. "The land is for blood," he had said, his voice as dry as the dust at my feet. "And you are no longer blood to this family." The charity ends today. He had pressed $5 silver into my palm, a severance, a final insult disguised as payment for the years I had served their family and loved their son. My brother-in-law, Henry, had watched from the doorway with a smirk, his gaze lingering on my worn dress and the small bundle of my husband's few belongings I clutched to my chest. I did not weep. The tears had been burned out of me in the long, silent nights after Daniel was gone, leaving behind an emptiness so vast it felt like a hollow space inside my own ribs. I simply turned and walked, my back to the fields Daniel and I had once dreamed of tending together, fields that were now forever barred to me. I walked until the Croft farm was a mere line on the horizon, until my grief was a dull, constant ache instead of a sharp, piercing blade. My path led me toward the broken lands, the stretch of territory no one wanted, where the soil was thin and the rocks were thick. It was there, nestled in a forgotten crease of the barren hills, that I saw it, a skeleton of a building, a stone mill, its great wheel silent and half swallowed by weeds, its roof a jagged mouth open to the sky. It was a monument to failure, a place where hope had clearly come to die. Yet, something in its stubborn, stony defiance called to me. In the dusty town office, the clerk, a man with weary eyes and ink-stained fingers, barely looked up. "That old ruin?" "The Abernathy Mill." He scoffed, a dry little sound like rustling paper. "The county took it for back taxes 20 years ago. The land's worthless. Sour soil. The creek runs foul half the year." He looked at me then, truly looked at the threadbare state of me, and a flicker of pity crossed his face. "It's no place for a woman alone." I laid the $5 silver on the worn wood of his desk. The coins were heavy with the weight of my past and the terrifying lightness of my future. "I'll take it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He stared at the coins, then at me. He sighed, shaking his head as he pulled out a dusty ledger and a deed form. $5 it is," he murmured, as if to himself. A fool's price for a fool's hope. He was wrong. It was not hope I was buying. It was simply ground to stand on, a place where no one could tell me to leave. It was a place to be forgotten, and in that, I thought, I might find a sliver of peace. The first week was a study in silence. The only sounds were the rasp of my own breathing and the mournful sigh of the wind moving through the mill's broken bones. The structure was even more derelict up close. The main grinding floor was a treacherous landscape of fallen beams and rubble, thick with the dust of ages. Upstairs, the hoppers were choked with ancient, petrified debris, and birds had nested in the rafters for generations. The land itself was worse. It was a canvas of grey, cracked earth, studded with pale, sharp stones that seemed to push up from below as if the very bones of the world were trying to escape the dead flesh of the soil. The creek the clerk had mentioned was a sluggish, brown scar on the landscape, choked with fallen branches, silt, and the refuse of decades. It did not flow so much as seep, a festering wound in the earth. I spent those first days simply walking the small parcel of land, feeling the profound weight of my decision settle upon me. I had not bought a home, I had bought a tombstone. One afternoon, seeking shelter from a sudden, cold rain, I huddled in the deepest part of the mill's foundation, where the great gears for the water wheel lay silent and rusted. My hand, tracing the cool, damp stones of the wall, found a loose one. Curiosity, a feeling I thought had been buried with Daniel, stirred faintly within me. I worked my fingers into the gap, pulling at the stone until it came free, revealing a small, dark cavity behind it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a book. It was a thick leather-bound journal, its pages filled not with words, but with intricate drawings, strange diagrams of water currents, and notes written in a spidery, archaic script. I recognized the handwriting from old letters Daniel had kept. It was his grandfather's, the man who had built this mill and lost it. I sat there in the gloom, the rain drumming a mournful rhythm on the stones above, and turned the brittle pages. It was not a diary of daily life. It was a record of an obsession. There were detailed sketches of the creek's path, notes on the changing color of the water through the seasons, and page after page dedicated to the different types of rock in the surrounding hills. He had given them names: ironstone, blue vein, chalk heart. One phrase appeared over and over, underlined twice: the water remembers the mountain. The soil must be taught to listen. It made no sense, yet I could not put it down. This book was a puzzle, a voice from a past as broken as the mill itself. It was the first thing in a long time that felt like more than just an ending. The journal became my only companion. By the weak light of the morning or the flickering flame of my small lamp at night, I studied its pages, trying to unlock the mind of the man who had written them. His words were a strange poetry of observation. He wrote of the stone's breath, the fine dust that puffed from a rock when struck just so. He wrote of river gold, not the kind men panned for, but a silken, grey sediment that appeared in the creek only after the heaviest rains. He believed the land was not dead, but sleeping, and that the keys to its awakening were the water and the stone. It was madness, of course. The ramblings of a failed miller who had lost everything. And yet, his conviction resonated across the years, a quiet, insistent hum beneath the surface of the ink. His obsession centered on the creek. He had drawn it dozens of times, mapping its every bend and shallow, marking places where the current slowed or quickened. He believed its sickness was the source of the land's own affliction. To heal the earth, he wrote, first heal the artery. That was a command I could understand. It was a physical task, something to pour my grief and my fear into. So, I began. I started at the edge of my property, where the water trickled in, and began the back-breaking work of clearing the channel. I had no tools but my own hands and a sturdy branch I sharpened into a lever. I hauled out waterlogged limbs, untangled thickets of dead roots that clawed at the banks like skeletal hands, and rolled aside stones that had sat there for so long they seemed a part of the earth itself. The mud was thick and cloying, sucking at my boots, staining my hands and my clothes. My muscles screamed in protest. Every evening, I would collapse onto my bedroll in the mill, my body a single, throbbing ache, only to rise with the sun and return to the water. Days bled into weeks. The pile of debris I dragged from the creek grew into a massive, tangled mound. I was no longer just a widow hiding from the world. I was a creature of mud and water, driven by a purpose I barely understood, guided by the hand of a ghost. The work was a penance and a prayer. With every rock I moved, I felt as if I were clearing a blockage in my own heart. With every tangle of roots I tore free, I was fighting back against the despair that had taken root within me. I was not just cleaning a creek, I was trying to make something flow again. One sweltering afternoon, as I wrestled a heavy, half-rotten log from the water, a shadow fell over me. I looked up, squinting into the sun, to see my former brother-in-law, Henry, sitting atop his horse on the bank above me. The smirk I remembered from the day I left was still fixed on his face. "Making mud pies, Agnes," he called down, his voice dripping with condescension. "I heard you'd lost your mind, but I didn't believe it till now. Playing in a ditch won't bring Daniel back. Nor will it put food on your table." I did not offer him the satisfaction of a reply. I simply turned my back to him, braced my feet, and gave the log another mighty heave. It shifted with a great sucking sound and began to move with the current. Henry laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You'll be begging at our door by winter," he said, before wheeling his horse around and riding off, leaving only the dust of his disdain hanging in the air. His visit left a bitter taste in my mouth, but it did not deter me. It hardened my resolve. A week later, another visitor arrived. This one came on foot, an older man with a weathered face and hands as gnarled as oak roots. He walked with a slight limp and introduced himself as Samuel, a farmer whose property lay a mile downstream. "The creek," he said, his voice a low rumble. He pointed a thick finger at the water moving past my feet. It was still murky, but it was moving with a purpose it hadn't had before. "It's running stronger. And cleaner. Hasn't done that in 20 years. My well is clearer than it's been since I was a boy." He looked from the water to me, his eyes taking in my mud-caked dress and the raw, blistered state of my hands. he saw the mountain of debris I had pulled from the banks. He didn't mock. He didn't pity. He simply nodded, a slow, appraising gesture. "This is hard work for one person," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. I finally found my voice. "It needs to be done." He stood there for a long time, watching the slow, steady current I had unleashed. He looked at the barren land around us, then back at the water. I could see the gears of a long life of agricultural wisdom turning in his mind. He didn't understand what I was doing, not really, but he understood the fundamental truth of it. He understood the connection between water and life. "Well," he said at last, turning to leave. "You keep at it." It wasn't much, but it was more than I had received from anyone else. It was a single seed of acknowledgement in a field of scorn, and for the first time, I felt I was not entirely alone. By the time the first cool winds of autumn began to whisper through the hills, the creek was transformed. It was no longer a stagnant wound but a living thing, a clear, determined ribbon of water that gurgled and sang as it flowed through my land. And with its clarity came the phenomenon the journal had called river gold. After a heavy rain, the water would carry a suspension of the finest silt, a shimmering, grey-brown powder that caught the light. The journal was filled with diagrams of how to capture this treasure. They depicted a series of low, temporary barriers and shallow channels, designed not to stop the water, but to slow it, to persuade it to release its precious cargo onto the land. Using stones from the creek bed and the hard-packed clay of the banks, I began to build them. It was delicate work, an act of negotiation with the water. I built a small, wing-shaped dam that gently nudged the main current toward a section of the flattest, most cracked earth. From there, a network of shallow, winding trenches, no deeper than my hand, spread out like veins, encouraging the water to fan out and slow to a near standstill. When the next rain came, I watched, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. It worked. The water, slowed by my crude engineering, deposited a thin, silken layer of sediment over the baked clay before seeping into the ground or rejoining the main channel. It was a barely perceptible film, but it was a start. The work became my entire existence. I would build, wait for rain, observe, and then adjust my channels. It was a conversation with the land, spoken in a language of water and earth. Winter arrived with a vengeance, locking the creek in ice and blanketing the land in a hard frost. My work outside was forced to a halt. I retreated into the mill, which was now a slightly more habitable ruin. I had patched the worst of the holes in the roof with scavenged slate and mud, and my small fire pit provided a meager but vital warmth. The winter was a time of stillness and study. I spent the long, dark evenings memorizing the journal, cross-referencing sketches of rocks with descriptions of the powders they could produce. I mended my worn clothes and rationed my dwindling supplies, which Samuel had quietly supplemented with a sack of potatoes and some salted meat left on a stump near my property line. He never said a word about it, and I never asked. It was a silent pact of mutual respect. I was hibernating, gathering strength, waiting for the thaw. For the first time since Daniel's death, I felt not the crushing weight of the past, but the quiet, thrilling anticipation of the future. I was waiting for spring to see if the sleeping land had listened. The first sign came not as a grand revelation, but as a subtle shift in color. As the last of the frost retreated and the spring sun warmed the earth, the patch of land I had so carefully fed with the river's silt began to change. It was no longer the pale, lifeless gray of the surrounding fields. It was a deep, rich brown, the color of damp chocolate. When I knelt and pressed my fingers into it, the ground yielded. It was soft, crumbly, and held the moisture from the melted frost instead of letting it run off. And then, one morning, I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible haze of green. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, that my desperate hope was conjuring phantoms. But as the days grew longer and warmer, the green became more certain. It was not the sparse, spiky weeds that grew in the rest of the territory. These were tiny, tender shoots of clover and wild grass, sprouting so thickly they looked like soft moss. The land was breathing again. Samuel came by not long after, his limp more pronounced in the damp spring air. He stopped at the edge of the greening patch and stared, his mouth slightly agape. He bent down, picked up a handful of the new soil and crumbled it between his fingers, bringing it to his nose to smell its earthy scent. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a wonder that mirrored my own. "In all my years," he said, his voice hushed, "I've never seen land come back like this." Never. He straightened up and looked at me, a new kind of respect in his gaze. He reached into a burlap sack he was carrying and pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. "Had these left over from my own planting," he said, handing it to me. It was heavy with seeds. Peas, beans, and hardy greens. "Let's see what your river gold can do for these." That afternoon, I carved neat rows into the soft earth and planted the seeds Samuel had given me. It felt like a sacred act, a pact between the resurrected soil, the gift of a friend, and my own stubborn hands. The small, green rectangle stood in stark, defiant contrast to the acres of barren clay surrounding it. It was an island of impossible life, a testament to a secret whispered from a journal, and I had the strange and powerful feeling that this was only the beginning. The real work, the work with the stones, was yet to come. My focus shifted from the water to the heart of the mill itself, the two massive, grooved granite stones that had sat immobile for half a century. The journal was explicit about the next step. The river gold had softened the soil, but that stone's breath would give it a soul. Daniel's grandfather had written pages about a specific type of rock found only in the high ridges behind my property, a dense stone with distinctive, deep blue veins running through it. This, he claimed, was the key. He believed that grinding this rock into a fine powder and mixing it with the soil would release ancient minerals, the very bones of the mountain, and provide a deep, lasting nourishment that ordinary soil lacked. Finding the blue-veined rock was an ordeal in itself. I spent days scrambling over the rocky hills, the journal's sketches in hand, until I finally found an outcropping that matched his drawings. The rock was incredibly heavy. I could only manage to pry loose and carry back a few small pieces at a time, loading them into a makeshift sling on my back. The journey was treacherous, and more than once I stumbled, the sharp weight of the stones bruising my shoulders. But each time, the memory of that patch of green drove me onward. Moving the millstones was impossible for me alone. They were colossal, each weighing more than a team of oxen. This was a task that required more than just resolve, it required help. I swallowed my pride and walked to Samuel's farm. I explained, as best I could, the mad theory from the journal. I told him I needed to grind rocks into dust. He listened patiently, his expression unreadable. I expected him to laugh, to finally dismiss me as the crazy widow the rest of the territory thought I was. Instead, he just stroked his grey beard for a long moment. "My father used to say the best soil had grit," he said slowly. "Said it gave the crops character." He looked toward the mill in the distance. "It's a two-man job, at least. And we'll need levers." Long ones. The next morning, he arrived with 2 stout poles of ironwood and a quiet determination that filled me with a profound sense of gratitude. Together, over the course of a week, we labored. It was a slow, agonizing process of leverage and brute force, of tiny, incremental movements. We managed to raise the top runner stone just enough to clean out the debris between them. Then, with a series of creaks and groans from the long-dormant machinery, we harnessed the water wheel and, for the first time in 50 years, the great stones began to turn. The sound was deafening, a low, grinding roar that vibrated through the floor and up into my bones. We fed my precious blue-veined rocks into the mechanism, and slowly, a fine, bluish-grey powder, as soft as flour, began to trickle out. It was the stone's breath. It smelled of deep earth and thunderstorms. The summer that followed was one of relentless work and quiet miracles. I spent my days mixing the fine stone dust with the silt-rich soil of my garden plot. The two elements combined to create a loam unlike anything I had ever seen, dark, fragrant, and teeming with life. I planted the rest of Samuel's seeds and tended to the growing plants with a devotion that bordered on religious. The results were staggering. The beanstalks climbed their poles with an aggressive vitality, the pea pods swelled until they were almost bursting, and the leafy greens grew to twice the size of any I had ever seen at the Croft farm, their color a deep, vibrant emerald. My small garden was not just growing, it was thriving with an impossible vigor. Word of the widow's strange garden began to spread through the territory, carried by travelers on the main road who could see the shocking patch of green from a distance. It became a local curiosity, a subject of gossip and speculation in the town. One day, a man I recognized as Thomas, the merchant who ran the general store, rode out to see it for himself. He was a quiet, serious man, known for his fairness and his keen eye for quality. He dismounted and walked the perimeter of my garden, his expression one of polite skepticism slowly melting into pure astonishment. He touched a leaf, examined a pea pod, and crumbled a bit of the dark soil in his hand. "I have never," he said, his voice filled with genuine awe, "seen anything like this. The quality is remarkable." He looked at me, his gaze direct and respectful. "I will buy everything you can spare. And I will pay you a premium for it." His offer was a turning point, a bridge back to the world I had left behind. But it also brought unwelcome attention. A week later, my father-in-law and Henry arrived. They did not stay on the road but rode right up to the edge of my garden, their horses trampling the wild grass. Mr. Croft's face was a thunderous mask of disbelief and rage. He saw the lush, overflowing bounty, and I could see the bitter jealousy in his eyes as he no doubt compared it to his own fields, which I knew had been struggling. "This is Croft land," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "Daniel's land. Our land. You have no right." Henry smirked behind him. "We've come to take back what's ours." They saw my success not as a triumph of my labor, but as something I had somehow stolen from them. I stood my ground, my hand stained with the very soil they sought to claim. The fear I had once felt in my father-in-law's presence was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. "I have the deed," I said, my voice even. "Signed and sealed by the county. This land is mine." Mr. Croft dismounted, his face flushed with anger. "A piece of paper means nothing. This mill was built by a Croft ancestor. It is our birthright." He took a step toward me, his intention clear. But before he could take another, two figures appeared. Samuel, walking up from the direction of his farm, carried a heavy walking stick that looked suspiciously like a club. And approaching from the road was Thomas, the merchant, who had evidently seen the Crofts ride out and had followed. He stood beside me, his presence a silent declaration of support. "The lady is right, Mr. Croft," Thomas said, his tone calm but firm. "The deed is legal. I saw the record myself at the clerk's office. This is her property." The town official who had sold me the land, drawn by the commotion, also arrived, looking nervous but resolute. "It's true," he stammered, avoiding Mr. Croft's glare. The sale was final. Faced with a united front, a respected farmer, the town's primary merchant, and a county official, my father-in-law's bluster faltered. He was a bully who thrived on isolating his victims, and I was no longer isolated. He stared from my defiant face to the silent men flanking me, his eyes burning with impotent rage. He spat on the ground, a final act of contempt. "You will regret this," he seethed, before mounting his horse. He and Henry rode away, defeated not by force, but by the quiet power of a community that had finally chosen to believe in me. In the silence that followed their departure, I looked at Samuel and Thomas. No grand speeches were made. Samuel simply nodded at me, a look of profound pride in his eyes. Thomas turned to me, a small, gentle smile on his face. "I think," he said softly, "you might need some help with your next harvest." It was in that moment, standing between the man who had given me the first seeds of hope and the man who offered me a future, that I understood my transformation was complete. I was no longer the outcast widow. I had become the woman who made the desert bloom. Thomas's respect, born from witnessing my toil, slowly blossomed into a deep and abiding affection. He courted me not with fancy words or gifts, but with quiet help, with shared labor in the fields, and with conversations that lasted long into the twilight hours. He proposed one evening as we stood by the restored water wheel, its steady rhythm a heartbeat for the farm. He asked me to be his wife, not to save me, but to build a life alongside me. I said yes. Years have passed since that day. The stone mill stands fully restored, its walls repointed, its roof sound. But it does not grind wheat for bread. Its great stones turn for only one purpose: to crush the blue-veined rock into the life-giving dust that has transformed this entire valley. The few acres I bought for $5 are now the most fertile and productive land in the territory, a patchwork of lush gardens, thriving orchards, and fields of healthy grain that ripple in the breeze. My home, which I share with Thomas and our children, is filled with light and laughter. The hollow space in my chest has been filled. Samuel is older now, his limp more pronounced, but he spends his afternoons on our porch, telling stories to my children about the old days, when all this was just dust and a stubborn woman with muddy hands. The Crofts still live on their farm, but their land yields less each year. They are trapped in the old ways, while the world around them has changed. They are a monument to what happens when you see only what is, and not what could be. Sometimes, I walk to the edge of the property, to the spot where I first began clearing the creek, and I look back at all that has grown from a single, desperate act. I think about the nature of value, how we are so often mistaken about what is precious and what is worthless. This land was considered refuse. This mill, a failure. The stones in the hills were just obstacles. The silt in the river was just mud. Everyone saw only the ruin, the decay, the end of a story. They failed to see the potential for rebirth sleeping just beneath the surface. They could not hear the secret the land was waiting to tell. And so, I want to ask you, what is the barren land in your own life? What is the broken-down mill you have dismissed as a ruin? What are the stones you curse as obstacles in your path? Look closer. Listen deeper. Within the things that have been discarded, within the places that have been forgotten, lies a hidden power. The work of restoration is slow. It is patient. It requires you to get your hands dirty. It demands that you believe in the possibility of green shoots in dead soil. But the secret is always there, waiting. It is in the water. It is in the stone. It is in the unwavering belief that nothing, and no one, is ever truly lost. You just have to be willing to start clearing the channel.